Hello and welcome to today's session, which will be on the Central Digital Platform. I'm Patrick Saunders, an associate here in the public sector team at Ward Hadaway.
And I'm Tim Kerr. I'm a partner here at Ward Hadaway in the public sector team.
As I said, today we're going to talk about Central Digital Platform and supply information. Can you begin by explaining what the Central Digital Platform is?
Yeah, of course I can. Well, the Central Digital Platform, which is not necessarily easy to say, is the online system that's referred to throughout the Procurement Act 2023 whenever there's an obligation to, for instance, publish notices or register information. The way it will work is broadly as follows. All contracting authorities who are going to procure public contracts and all suppliers who want to bid for public contracts will register on that platform. All notices that are required to be published by contracting authorities under the Procurement Act will be uploaded to that Central Digital Platform so that they're available there for everyone to see. Mm-hmm. Suppliers will submit what's called core information about themselves and also about related parties, which I think we'll probably talk about in a minute. And this will be a requirement. They have to do this if they want to compete for public contracts. And the platform will be searchable. It'll be available for anyone to have a look at and find out all this information. And that's a major plank of the government's transparency agenda to ensure that all the information that relates to public procurement is available for everyone to see. And what they're saying is they're hoping that will drive innovation and will deliver better value for money. In fact, the Central Digital Platform is built on the existing Finder Tender platform. Right. So it's not new technology, it's not really a new product, but it's an extension of that technology, which is why we're fairly comfortable that it will work, because it is tried and tested technology.
Okay, so what are the main changes that we're going to see when it all comes into effect?
Well, I suppose the first main change is there'll just be one platform. There'll be one place to go to both upload information and search for information. I think the other major change is the requirement for registration on that system, and we'll pick that up in a minute. And there are also some other changes to do with how you come up with an exemption if there's information that you want to withhold because it's too sensitive. There are some subtle changes there as well.
Okay, and I've read something about unique identifiers. What exactly are they?
Yes, so not a new concept, but it's going to be much more widely used now within procurement law. So every contracting authority and every supplier will, once they're registered, get a unique identifier. So that'll be their identifier, their registration number, if you like, which will run with them for life. Also, each procurement process will get its own unique identifier, and every contract that has been procured through a public procurement process will get its own unique identifier. So when you publish more information further down the line about a particular procurement or a particular contract, you'll use that same identifier. So it keeps all that information together, it enables you to track, it enables you to search. So it'll be much easier to identify information, what it relates to and who it relates to going forward.
Okay, so where is it going to fit in relation to an actual procurement process?
Good question. So the first thing is that contracting authorities and suppliers will be required to register on the platform. So that's before you even begin a procurement process. Everyone's got to be on there. The current understanding is that the platform will be available for contracting authorities shortly before the Procurement Act comes into effect, give them a window of opportunity to register. And then slightly later on, suppliers will be able to register to get on. So all of that happens before you actually think about a procurement process.
Okay.
When it comes to a particular procurement, so let's say a contracting authority has decided it wants to it wants to outsource its facilities management services or whatever, then the first time that authority publishes a notice about that procurement for the facilities management services, that procurement process will be allocated a unique identifier. which will then be repeated throughout that procurement process on every other notice that is published. Once the contracting authority starts to engage with the market and actually says, I want you to express an interest in this, or I want you to send tenders in relation to this opportunity, it will ask the potential suppliers, the bidders, to confirm their unique identifiers, and will ask them to confirm that they have registered on the central digital platform and that they've put all the information in they have to put in. So once you get to the opening up of the competition, that happens, and all the suppliers have to confirm that they have registered. And then from that point, all the information that's published or shared in relation to that procurement will use all those unique identifiers of the contracting authority, of the bidders who are engaged in the process, and the procurement process itself. And again, as I said before, that means everything is linked together and is all trackable. Just one point I'll just make is, I did say that when an authority first publishes a notice that relates to a procurement, that procurement will get an identifier. Yeah. That obviously could be the tender notice, the advert, if you like, that you publish, but it could happen before that. So, as I think you know, some authorities will have a requirement to publish an annual pipeline notice, where they say, we've got a number of procurements that are coming up in the future. And if in that pipeline notice they've identified the future procurement of its facilities management services, it will be allocated an identifier then.
That early?
Yes, and so when they come to then publish perhaps a pre-market engagement notice or the tender notice, they will use the identifier that's already been allocated. That's certainly the theory as to how this is going to work.
Right, okay. So in that, how can contracting authorities ensure that they've received all of the correct information?
Also a fair point. The way the platform will work is that when you're putting your information in, so let's say you're a supplier who's registering and having to input a certain amount of information about itself in, the system will provide a number of prompts and a number of fields that have to be completed. So the system itself will tell you if there's any information missing, and probably won't even let you press submit until you've filled in all the fields. So in theory, it shouldn't be possible to register information or publish a notice unless all the fields are full. So that doesn't quite answer your question, but it gets you some way there.
Yeah.
However, it will always be up to the contracting authority to somehow verify the accuracy of the information that it's received. So there'll always be a need for a contracting authority at some point in the procurement to do its due diligence, and if necessary, get evidence that backs up the information that the supplier has already fed to it, particularly when you're checking technical qualifications or experience, things like that. So there's no substitute for that at the end of the day.
Should make it easier, but there's no guarantees on it, basically.
Yes, and in that sense, it's no different to where we are now, because at the pre-qualification or selection questionnaire stage, you ask for a certain amount of information, and you take it on faith, on trust, until you get further down the line and you've got your preferred bidder, and then what you're supposed to do is a bit of due diligence to check that information was all correct.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. And are there any particular issues which relate to frameworks or dynamic markets?
Yes, there are. There are some kind of nuances that are worth knowing about, obviously, for frameworks and for the new dynamic markets. So, for instance, when you're calling off a contract under a framework, then that call-off itself requires a separate procurement process and its own identifier, although it will be linked to the identifier that was allocated to the original procurement process that procured the framework and that was allocated to the framework agreement.
Okay.
So all of these things will be linked together. So the identifier for the call-off will be allocated when the first notice in relation to that call-off is published. And that, again, might be when a pipeline notice was published a year or two before. Mm-hmm. Because the pipeline notice just says, we're going to have a requirement to procure this. It won't necessarily say whether that's going to be by bespoke procurement or under a framework.
No.
So that's how that can happen. When it comes to dynamic markets, that unique identifier will be allocated when the first notice is issued to set the dynamic market up. So the dynamic market will get its own identifier. But then when you call off a contract under a dynamic market, you have to use the competitive flexible procedure. So you go through a competitive process, which will typically begin with the publication of a tender notice.
Yeah.
And then, so obviously when you do that, that procurement process will be allocated its own identifier. And that will be linked to the identifier for the dynamic market itself. So this kind of feels a bit complicated, but I think the common sense approach is every individual element of procurement, whether it be an entity like a contracting authority or supplier or a process, gets its own identifier, and where they need to be linked, they will be linked.
I can see in my head how that would work. It would almost be like a separate matter within a main matter. But yeah, it's on the face of it, it sounds quite confusing.
Yes.
Yeah.
It won't be when it happens, because when we actually see the identifiers in black and white, and we'll see the way they're linked, because you'll get like a main identifier, and then you might get a /1, /2, /3. It will make sense when you actually see them.
Yeah. Okay, and it seems to me there's a lot of information that has to be disclosed by suppliers throughout the procurement process. Are there any exemptions that can be applied to limit the amount of information required?
Well, there are some, and I get that suppliers perhaps are a bit concerned that the new rules mean they're going to have to disclose a lot more information. That's true in some respects, but in others, we're just tidying up how the current system works and making it more efficient through the central platform. But yes, there are some exemptions that might be relevant to suppliers. They're all found in Section 94 of the Procurement Act. As I've said before, I always keep my copy with me at all times. Broadly speaking, those exemptions fall into two categories. So the first is where withholding the information is necessary for the purpose of safeguarding national security. I'm not going to go into that in any detail.
No.
I can assure you that in the many years I've been doing procurement work, I've never ever had to consider matters of national security. It clearly probably more relevant if you're doing central government contracts, Ministry of Defence contracts, that sort of thing. The second broad exemption is where the information is sensitive commercial information, and there's an overriding public interest that it should be withheld and not made public. So that's broadly the second one.
Okay, and what does sensitive commercial information mean in this context?
Well, this is an area where actually the guidance is quite helpful, and I think I've said to you before, Patrick, that it's worth going online and looking at the procurement and guidance that the Cabinet Office has published, because it's quite readable and quite pragmatic and practical, and they actually give some examples of what might be commercially sensitive information. So, for instance, that would include trade secrets, which I know is a bit of a broad concept, but we kind of all know what we mean by trade secrets, and any other information which could prejudice a supplier's commercial interests, like its prices, for instance, the financial model that it's using to decide its prices, its business plan, its profit margins, things like that could potentially be commercially sensitive information, and so you could withhold those. Also, details about its intellectual property. I think the government has always understood that there's an overriding public interest to ensure that suppliers don't have to disclose that sort of sensitive information, because if they do, they'll probably withdraw from bidding for public contracts, and that narrows the market for public contracts, which is not in the public interest. So the government's always accepted that.
Okay, so I understand that. I'm trying to get my head around when a contracting authority might find itself disclosing commercially sensitive information. Could you explain a little bit?
Well, yes. I mean, for instance, if you recall, a contracting authority has to publish something called a contract details notice within 30 days of entering into a public contract that it's procured. Also, if the contract exceeds a value of £5 million, it has to publish a copy of that contract. That will go on the central digital platform and will become a public document. So what Section 94 enables the authority to do is to redact information. So if it had to supply the contract, it could redact it by taking out that sensitive pricing information or things like that. So there are very real times when a contracting authority might otherwise be asked to sort of reveal that information. There's another point as well, which is that in the contract award notice, which is the notice you publish before you enter into the contract, remembering contract details notice is after, contract award notice is before, it triggers the standstill period, just to remind people of that. One of the bits of information that the contracting authority is supposed to include in there is information about essentially the ultimate owners of the supplier. And just in very broad terms, government's quite insistent these days that, quite rightly, that there's full transparency as to the ownership of suppliers, particularly where shares are held offshore, that sort of thing, and clearly a lot of sensitivity around Russian businesses and sanctions busting and that sort of thing. So in the contract award notice, details of the sort of ultimate ownership would have to go in, and there are some exemptions to the information that's disclosed there if there's potential information that might put an individual at risk of violence or intimidation, which could be the case if you're talking about overseas entities that operate in particularly sensitive environments. So there are some little nuances there that might be relevant to some suppliers over time.
Right, that's helpful. So what information do suppliers actually have to disclose when they register on the central digital platform?
Yes, so the Procurement Act refers to what it calls core information, which when you register, that's what you've got to put in, and then you need to keep that core information up to date. So that core information falls into sort of four basic categories. So there's what I call basic information: name, address, company registration number, VAT number, all that stuff. Which at the moment you have to supply every time you fill in a selection questionnaire. The beauty of the central digital platform is you fill it in once, and unless it changes, you don't have to go back in and update it, and it's there. The second category is information relating to the sort of economic, financial standing of that supplier, so accounts information, that sort of thing. The third is information related to connected persons, and that's people like what I was just talking about, the ultimate owners. In company law, you talk about persons with significant control. So it's information about them. And then the fourth category of information is information about the possible grounds for exclusion, which you and I have talked about in another session.
We have, yeah.
So effectively, most suppliers will be confirming when they register their information that none of the grounds for exclusion apply to them. But obviously some suppliers will have to disclose that maybe one does. So that's, in a sense, the core information. And largely that reflects the situation we're in today. That's largely the information that a contracting authority collects at the beginning of a procurement. What we're doing here is changing the way in which that's collected and the way in which that's supplied by the supplier, hopefully to make it easier.
It should be much more efficient if it works out.
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely, yeah. No, it should be. And I think one of the objections, one of the criticisms by suppliers, particularly SMEs over the years, is the fact that they've had to repeat things over and over again. So you're probably aware from personal dealings, Patrick, that the government has been promoting for years this concept of tell us once.
Yes.
So once you've told the government something about yourself once, you shouldn't have to tell them again and again and again. They should already have the information. And that concept is now coming into procurement. So suppliers should only have to tell the central digital platform once. They might have to go in and update it if something changes.
But they should be minor amendments. That should be an easy job.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think that works. Yeah.
Okay. So when a supplier wants to participate in a public procurement, is there any other information that it has to make available apart from the information that it uploads to the central digital platform?
Well, yes, there will be, because when you do when a contracting authority does a specific procurement, there will be information that's relevant to that procurement, which isn't in the core information that's been supplied. So there are two obvious things that spring to mind. One is information that relates to what you would call associated persons, associated parties. So I talked about connected parties, which would be people like your owners sitting on a beach in the Bahamas. In this case, by associated persons, we mean perhaps consortium members, subcontractors, people who the bidder is going to work with to deliver that contract.
Yeah.
So if for instance, the contracting authority is outsourcing all its facilities management services, there might be one particular lead supplier who's going to be the main bidder, but they're going to subcontract all the catering services to a catering supplier. So that catering supplier will be an associated person.
Okay.
And the contracting authority would seek information about that associated person. The similar basic information, core information that the main supplier provides through the central digital platform. And the other element is what are called now, under the Procurement Act, conditions of participation. So this is additional information that contracting authorities are entitled to ask. Okay. In their discretion, they can decide what they want to ask, and their only limitation is it has to be proportionate in relation to the procurement that's being carried out. And that could include, and probably would include, questions about insurances and your health and safety record and particular examples of your expertise and your experience in that sector, in that particular field that relates to the thing that's being procured. And again, these are all things that are currently picked up in the standard selection questionnaire. It's just that the way in which they're being asked now is slightly different. And also, whereas the current selection questionnaire is almost like mandatory in terms of the questions it asks, these conditions of participation are not mandatory, and there's flexibility as to what you can ask. As I said, as long as you are proportionate.
Okay. That's been extraordinarily helpful, Tim, and it's really clarified how the central digital platform will work and what information suppliers need to provide.
Thank you, Patrick.